Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our virtual program tonight. My name is Karina Kowalski, and I am the Manager of Education for the Mercer Museum and Bonto Castle in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. I want to welcome you all to our Zoom. And before we get started, I want to familiarize you all with the Zoom platform. You will notice that your cameras and microphones have been turned off for this program. If you have any questions throughout the program, please put it in the Q&A function below, and we will address all questions at the end of the program. I am delighted tonight to introduce our lecture tonight and our partnership with the Rufus Porter Museum of Art and Ingenuity in Bridgton, Maine. This came about as our changing exhibit space in the Mercer Museum, located in Doylestown, has a number of artifacts and items from Rufus Porter himself. So if you want to learn more about what's on display or anything we have virtually, we offer a calendar of events and virtual programs as well. Please check out our website, mercermuseum.org, for more information about visiting us in person or checking out some of our virtual programming. Now, without further ado, I'm honored to introduce Carla Leandri Ryder, the Executive Director of the Rufus Porter Museum of Art and Ingenuity in Bridgton, Maine. Carla?
Great, can everyone hear and see me? All right, well, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here and to be partnering with the Mercer Museum to provide this wonderful lecture. As Karina said, I'm Carla Leandri Ryder. I'm the Executive Director of the Rufus Porter Museum of Art and Ingenuity located in Bridgton, Maine. Those of you who are familiar with Maine, Bridgton is about an hour northwest of Portland. Founded in 2005, our mission is to celebrate the life, times, and legacy of a remarkable 19th century New Englander through preservation and promotion of creativity and invention. So Rufus Porter is well recognized in the folk art world for his wall murals. However, he was much, much more than just an artist. He was also a musician, a teacher, an inventor, and founder of Scientific American magazine, which is still in publication today. So some of you are probably wondering, how did a museum dedicated to Rufus Porter end up in Bridgton, Maine? Well, Porter lived in the Bridgton area from age 9 to 15, and he also spent much of his youth in Portland. Our museum campus is home to two historic houses, the circa 1840 John and Maria Webb House and the circa 1790 Nathan Church House, which is one of Bridgton's oldest surviving buildings and the original headquarters of the museum. Our permanent exhibits feature the story of Rufus Porter and include a collection of his miniature watercolor portraits, a room with wall murals done in his style, and I say in his style because Porter rarely signed his work, and of course these walls are no exception. And also he trained others to paint just like him, including his nephew, Jonathan Poor. We also have models of some of his inventions, books and pamphlets written by Porter, and early editions of Scientific American. We also have special exhibit space and a highly acclaimed gift shop. In addition to exhibits, we also offer classes, lectures, and other educational opportunities that further our mission. This summer, our major fundraiser is a garden tour with the gardens kept secret until the day of the event. We are a seasonal museum, open from mid-June to mid-October, although we are available by appointment, especially during the off-season. To learn more about us, please visit our website at rufusportermuseum.org. Follow us on Facebook, and you can also follow us on Instagram. And if you're unable to visit us in person, Maine might just be a little too far away. We do offer an online tour on our website, as well as virtual access to our museum collection. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our speakers. We have Laura Sprague, Independent Museum Curator located in Portland, Maine, and Justin Wolff, Professor of Art History at the University of Maine in Orono.
Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me? I hope you can hear me. It's a pleasure to join the Mercer Museum and the Rufus Porter Museum of Art and Ingenuity this afternoon. Justin Wolff and I are delighted to share our research about the remarkable American, Rufus Porter, that culminated in the exhibition, Rufus Porter's Curious World, Art and Invention in America, 1815 to 1860, that opened at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art in Brunswick, Maine, in December of 2019. Justin Wolff and I also edited the accompanying book co-published with Penn State University Press. And on the dust jacket seen here are hikers and goats teetering on the White Mountain cliffs in this wonderful detail from Porter's signed House Mural cycle and dated 1838. Hang on. It was a beautiful installation seen here in the Halford Gallery, and Justin and I are deeply grateful to Anne Collins Goodyear and Frank Goodyear, the Bowdoin Museum's co-directors, for their unflagging support, and to the dedicated staff who helped make it possible. Generous loans from 30 institutions and private collectors, from the Library of Congress to the Minnesota Historical Society, helped tell Porter's story. These objects illustrate the catalog, and you'll see many of them today. So who was Rufus Porter, and why should we care about him? An itinerant artist and inventor, a polymath who worked across media and scales, Porter was born in 1792 in Massachusetts and was raised in Western Maine. He's known to many people for different things. He was a talented painter of panoramic landscapes, landscape murals, and small miniature portraits in examples seen here. During a compelling publishing career in New York City, he founded Scientific American in 1845. The magazine, arguably Porter's greatest enduring legacy, celebrated its 175th anniversary last year. Porter's real passion, however, was for invention and mechanical improvement, especially mechanized flight with a steam-powered traveling balloon, an early dirigible-like aircraft. He called it his aeroport, and the illustration here is from one of his newspapers. His efforts to build a prototype reached its peak in the early 1850s, but after the project failed, Porter receded into obscurity. He died unheralded in New Haven, Connecticut in 1882. Not until the 1920s did he emerge from the shadows, thanks to two American painting scholars, and then between 1950 and 1980, with books by the arts editor, Jean Lippman. During this period, Time magazine called him the Yankee da Vinci, an American response to the great Italian Renaissance artist-inventor, Leonardo da Vinci. Our story begins in 1815 with Porter's first documented activities in Maine and ends with his quest to develop mechanized flight in the 1850s. Much of this time was based in Massachusetts, and Porter's itinerancy routes wound through New England. Porter, like many Americans of his time, was grounded in the ideas of the Enlightenment, represented by Benjamin Franklin and the books of useful knowledge that became increasingly available. Franklin, depicted in this wonderful Caffieri bust around 1785 at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, is well known for Poor Richard's Almanac, with its weather forecasts, household hints, and puzzles. Porter possessed the same sort of inquiring mind and shared the same quest for knowledge as did Franklin. Americans accessed useful knowledge through books, and Porter was no exception. He knew and was inspired by manuals and encyclopedias, such as a repertory of arts and manufactures, published in London between 1794 and 1802, and this is a volume from the Bowdoin College Special Collections. Here, a horizontal windmill, patented in 1796, may well have served as a model for one that Porter built in Portland, Maine in 1818. He mined these and other titles when he compiled his own books, notably the various editions of a select collection of valuable and curious arts and interesting experiments, subtitled Curious Arts. Porter was 8 years old when his family moved from eastern Massachusetts to the hills of western Maine in today's Bridgton. He received a practical education on his father's farm, which he recalled as, quote, beautifully variegated with woodlands, high and steep hills, and running brooks. There he seized every opportunity to acquire a practical knowledge of mechanical operations, and especially such arts and sciences as are required in the introduction of useful improvements. His formal education at nearby Freiburg Academy was limited to only a few terms, but with headmaster Amos Cook, one of New England's most progressive educators, Porter was engaged in books, learning, and the wonders of the world. By 1811, Porter moved into Portland, a vibrant seaport teeming with entrepreneurs and itinerant artists. There, Marcus Quincy, a townsman, artisan, and merchant, taught Porter the foundational skills of the painting trade. After the Revolution, Portland experienced a building boom with elegant commercial structures and residences. None may have stirred Porter's imagination more than the 1807 observatory, the 82-foot-high octagonal signal tower on Munjoy Hill that survives today. From this marvel of engineering, Lemuel Moody used signal flags, you see them on the top of the cupola, to announce the arrival of their ships, and he welcomed visitors whose climb to the cupola was rewarded by views of Casco Bay and the White Mountains with majestic Mount Washington 70 miles to the west. Charles Codman's painting, Entertainment of the Boston Rifle Rangers at the Brooklyn Museum, seen here, celebrated an 1829 militia encampment on Munjoy Hill's parade ground. This scene with Casco Bay and its islands would inspire Porter's landscape murals in the years ahead. Notably, in 1811, Porter joined the Portland Light Infantry, an elite private militia company, and he signed its ledger book, now at the Maine Historical Society. He served as the company's musician, playing fife and drum, a talent likely encouraged at Freiburg Academy with its progressive music curriculum. This side drum from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, an especially beautiful example decorated by Charles Hubbard, is a type Porter would have played. During the War of 1812, Porter served in Portland's forts along with hundreds of other Maine and Massachusetts militiamen as a British invasion of the Maine coast was a serious threat. This painting at the Maine Historical Society depicts Fort Scammell on House Island in the center left, seen from Fort Preble, which is now in South Portland. One of Porter's light infantry comrades was John Hancock Hall, a brilliant mechanic and inventor who was then perfecting his patent for a breech loading rifle. His patent drawing, seen here, survives in the National Archives. Hall's efforts helped revolutionize manufacturing with interchangeable parts, and he shortly moved to Harpers Ferry, Virginia, to run the U.S. Armory. After the War of 1812, Porter, the polymath, began work in Portland in all three areas for which he would become known: for art, invention, and publishing. He compiled a music book of militia tunes. He found investors for his windmill, and he turned to painting miniature portraits as a way to generate income. With his facility and knowledge of painting, Porter may have been inspired to take up miniature profiles by the many itinerant artists who traveled through Portland. The earliest known miniatures attributed to him were painted of people he knew. For example, Benjamin Lane served with Porter in the Portland Light Infantry, and portraits of him, his wife, and a child in a private collection survive in their wonderful original grain painted frames that Porter surely made and decorated himself. The Bowdoin College Museum of Art's likeness of Thomas Long, a musician, was made at the same time as his sister Betsy, whose portrait is at the Rufus Porter Museum. They're seen here with Porter's 1820 advertising broadside at the American Antiquarian Society, a rare and unique imprint that itemizes his costs for several different types of likenesses. He offered a simple cut paper silhouette for 20 cents, and we know of none of those that survive that are known. And a watercolor on ivory miniature cost $8. So the side views that you see here in watercolor would have cost about $2. Porter's final documented activity in Portland was the construction of a horizontal windmill on Congress Street in an historically windy location. Horizontal describes the platform of the sails that move parallel to the ground, as illustrated in this patent design from the Repertory of Arts and Manufacturers. With the support of merchant Bradbury Atwood, Porter formed a small stock company to raise capital and built it in 1818. Newspapers nationwide picked up the little item, praising its novelty and efficiency. However, after it was damaged in a storm, Porter lamented that he could not raise funds for its repair, nor could he sell it. Soon he left Maine, seeking greener pastures in Greater Boston. There, Porter expanded his miniature painting, using a camera obscura to speed his work and increase his accuracy. Consisting of an adjustable lens mounted on a hooded box, a mirror reflected the sitter's likeness onto a surface that could be traced. The camera on the left is at the George Eastman Museum, and it dates to Porter's years. And you see how it was used in the image on the right. But Porter likely made his own camera obscura, and with it, his technique advanced rapidly. By the 1830s, he had honed his skills when he took the portraits of the Flagg family of Andover, Massachusetts. In his charming likeness of little Martha Flagg in the lower left, she appears in blue with braids and ribbons in her hair and a delicate coral necklace. A book publisher, Timothy Flagg, knew and had access to high quality paper, and the English stock with the turnbull watermark you see on the right contributes to the portrait's fine quality. One of the most fascinating aspects of Porter is that as a spatial thinker, he worked in scales large and small and easily shifted from flat 4-inch miniatures to complex 3-dimensional projects. While pursuing itinerant painting, he also developed an invention shop where talented young mechanics could be trained, and he worked collaboratively with a wide range of artisans. For example, Abel Bowen, the Boston engraver and publisher, and his brother Henry Bowen, a printer, helped Porter realize a project that combined artistry with printing and a mechanical component, his revolving almanac of 1821 to 22. Perpetual almanacs were used throughout early America, but this was something new and different, and so typical of Rufus Porter. With just a turn of a paper wheel, called a revolver, this calendar provided a ready reference for days of the year and phases of the moon. A window cut from the paper sheet reveals a horse laboring in the fields during the seasons of the year. Out of the thousands that Porter is believed to have made, fewer than a dozen are known to survive, and this wonderful example at the Maine State Museum retains its original wooden frame. An innovative example of paper engineering, Porter's revolving almanac is considered one of America's most earliest and most sophisticated wheel charts. Another extant invention is the revolving rifle Porter developed in 1826 with Joseph Center of Boston. Perhaps his mechanism was inspired by John Hancock Hall. But Porter sold his model to Samuel Colt, who was working on a similar mechanism, and he made the Colt revolver a household name. Porter's rifle model survives in the Colt collection at the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, Connecticut. By 1822, Porter had added panoramic mural painting to his repertoire, and Justin will describe that now. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Laura. Yeah, so from 1821 to 1840, Porter lived in Billerica, about 25 miles. Yeah, you can go to the next slide, Laura, thanks.
Okay.
watercolor. Thank you. Which is about 25 miles northwest of Boston, the town of Billerica. And he lived adjacent to the Middlesex Canal, which was a major engineering feat that connected the once sort of rural area to Boston. I mean, today, if you drive through 495 and you think about Lawrence, Mass, and Lowell, Mass, and so forth, you understand how industrial that area is, and the Middlesex Canal is what made that possible. And while he lived there, he witnessed the community grow into a busy industrial region. And the landscape scenery represented in this small watercolor from the Billerica Historical Society became typical of the murals that he painted in houses in the surrounding communities. You can see just in this watercolor here, the fields, of course, the rivers and bays, the footpaths, the box houses. But I think more importantly is that sort of hustle and bustle, that sense of movement and possibility. And I think Billerica was really critical to the formation of Porter's, not only his mural painting, but also his enthusiasm for transportation and communication networks. It was a rich place and a fortuitous place for a person like Porter to have moved to. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, Porter featured instructions for landscape painting in the Curious Arts. In particular, this 1826 edition has these lovely this lovely frontispiece. And the important thing about Porter's instructions for landscape painting is that these were meant specifically for painting landscapes on walls in interior homes, right? We called them murals in shorthand, but these were not easel paintings, of course. These were meant for the walls of homes in his local community. And you can see that the frontispiece here to the 1826 edition, it features his recommended landscape motifs. You see a group of boys, for instance, rolling hoops along the ground, another boy flying a kite. The kind of thinking that Porter is so remembered for. Just this frontispiece alone shows a kind of movement through space, perspective for one, but also that sense of mobility and movement that's so critical to Porter's life. In 1822, we found this advertisement in a Providence, Rhode Island paper, the Providence Patriot, in which Porter offered to paint walls in, quote, full color, so that inhabitants of these New England homes could spend the gloomy winter months, as he put it, quote, amidst pleasant groves and verdant fields. Now, prior to our research on Rufus Porter, it had been long assumed that he had painted dozens of homes along the eastern seaboard. And we discovered really that only 3 mural cycles bear his signature, and probably just about several more are very likely attributed to him and to his son Stephen Porter, who worked with him. And all of these mural cycles are within 30 miles of Billerica. And they feature these recurring themes, bays and harbors, boats, hillside farms, towering trees and fences in sharp perspective, the kinds of things that he would have seen in Western Maine as a boy. Next slide, Laura, thank you. The Francis Howe House, and you see the murals here in situ from photographs from the 1920s. They date from 1838. Just as an aside, these murals have been carefully excavated from the home and are no longer in situ and are in a private collection in good care. but the Francis House murals are typical, as an excellent example of the variety of picturesque scenes that he could paint on interior walls. And again, it's typical insofar as it shows the mingling of rural scenery with the encroachment and the beginning of commercial activity, through travel, of course, through commercial farming and so forth. And this is a key element to our understanding of Porter, is that he lived during this moment of profound transformation where America went from an agrarian nation to a commercial nation. And this is a theme that we hit again and again through the exhibition and through the publications, and I think is very apropos of the exhibition on view here. You see here these towering trees and the rolling farmland again, the bodies of water, and these sort of trademark puffy clouds in the background. What really impresses about these House murals, however, I think, is this this notion of a spatial imagination that Laura has already mentioned. And spatial imagination and spatial thinking are really key to understanding Porter's contributions to American art and to American science. You know, he worked across multiple disciplines in scales, you know, both large and small. And he had mechanical skills with small machine parts, and we'll see that in a minute. But he also, as you can see here, had the skills of sort of the technical skills of painting, but also the perceptual skills of painting to represent panoramic landscape scenes and vistas in these very sort of irregular and cramped interiors, right? And so that's what we describe as this sort of spatial imagination. You know, the challenge of painting a landscape in a very small room, in fact, with low ceilings, is evident in, and again, these 1920 photos of these House murals in situ in their original location. Next slide, Laura, please. So, you know, this mural along the House stairs, I think, is especially imaginative. For one, the steep hillside that we see here, probably inspired by the steep white mountains that he grew up nearby when he was living in Western Maine. You can see this sort of steep hillside with these stepped mountain ledges, right? This is what we feature on the cover of the book because it's such a special image. It mimics, of course, the steepness and the action of the stairwell itself, to which it's adjacent. And this sort of spatial thinking has that sort of marvelous effect of joining together an intimate domestic space with a sort of sublime natural scenery. And this is Porter's, one of his great sort of legacies, right? Is that the mural is able to, it provides more than just a colorful and fancy decoration to an interior. It visualizes the relationships between different scales and settings, bringing the natural world here into the home of this family in a number of different ways. So in the next slide, please, Laura, we can really see this in full effect. You know, his most memorable or perhaps most recognized is a better way of describing it, wall painting, is also from the House from 1838, and it's the Steamship Victory mural. And it's a vibrant painting that seems, above all, to my mind, to celebrate the freedom of movement and mobility. You know, there's a movement and mobility of the eye of the beholder of the mural, from near distance to middle distance, across the mountains and into the vista of the horizon. But there's also the movement of the pedestrian, the presumed pedestrian walking along that fence, the movement of the ships heading out to open water, of the rolling hills. And again, I mean, you know, to my mind, what strikes me really here is this magical spatial imagination. The way that this walled room is attached to an open vista so that the inhabitants of this space can almost feel their movement through their own house as if it was a walk through panoramic New England, right? I mean, that's a really sort of special knack that Porter perfected, for sort of mapping domestic space onto larger regions. And it really speaks to the way that his mind could amplify ideas into large concepts. I think it's also worth pointing out here, as Laura mentioned, that Porter grew up in Western Maine, by his own description, sailing skiffs on the Saco River. And it's nice to think of a sort of a more personal and perhaps emotional element into these scenes. Porter's vision of movement as a child across the Saco River is a theme that comes up again and again. And I think we see it here again, sort of amplified. It's important to point out that this love of movement that we see in his murals coincided with the transportation revolution that so many historians have pointed out, marked and characterized this era of American history, right? I won't go into a great length here, but of course we have here the advent of the steam engine and what that made possible for steamships, steamboats, and of course for the railroad. And I think that his murals really represent some of that optimism, that possibility of being somewhere else, whether literally or figuratively. And another important point here is that it's interesting to note that Porter offered his mural skills, his wall painting skills, to members of his own class, right? He was not seeking to become what today we would think of as a fine artist. He was really practicing what he called a useful art. I mean, he was a commercial artist looking to make a living for sure, but he saw these murals as just another of these useful arts, as he called them, in so many of his publications. It was a way, again, as he put in that ad from 1822 in the Providence Patriot, to bring color to a gloomy interior, right? And this is important, it was cheaper than wallpaper, right? And this is what Porter meant by a useful art. Now, he ceased mural painting, as far as we can tell, in the late 1830s, as he turned his attention to yet another endeavor that he considered a useful art, which was editing and publishing scientific journals and newspapers. And I'll hand it back over to Laura to say some more about that.
Thanks, Justin. Well, Porter continued his publishing ventures in the 1820s. He was always looking out for a source of income. He had a wife and many, many children to feed. And in 1825, he launched a new printing venture, the compilation of useful knowledge that he called A Select Collection of Valuable and Curious Arts. The Enlightenment student, Porter continued to understand the importance of making information accessible, and he synthesized in these volumes his interest in arts and science instruction. Not unlike Franklin's almanacs, Porter's small how-to volumes, quote, combined recreation with improvement in useful knowledge. His table of contents, seen here, one page of which is seen here, revealed dozens of topics covered, from simple science experiments to instructions for painting landscapes on the walls of rooms. An immensely popular DIY manual, it saw 5 editions in just 2 years. While publishing and promoting the sales of the curious arts, Porter continued to work on invention, and by 1840, he had relocated to New York City to pursue some of these mechanical improvements, drawn to the metropolis by yet another Inventors Institute. He hadn't been there long, however, before he completely shifted gears again and seized the opportunity to promote useful knowledge, this time through the weekly press. Sorry. There. Based in New York City in Lower Manhattan, Porter edited and published 4 different newspapers, beginning with the New York Mechanic in 1841. He renamed it the American Mechanic the next year to gain broader appeal. In 1845, he founded Scientific American, his best-known newspaper that endures today. His new mastheads for all of these journals combined scrolling vines and wonderful typography with images of mechanics, modes of transportation, and temples of knowledge. His subtitles reveal his intentions. He intended them to be an inventor's advocate, patent office reporter, an expositor of arts and trade. He described for his readers how the US Patent Office worked, and he promoted an enormous range of inventions. For example, in the Scientific American in 1846, he published his design for an elevated railway, a great idea that separated noisy and dangerous train cars from the pedestrians. But it was only an idea that was only realized by others 22 years later, when New York's 9th Avenue L was begun in 1868. In the field of American journalism, Porter engaged his readers with compelling content and is regarded for his innovative style with these large illustrations of new inventions that he had engraved and featured on every front page of every issue. And through his publications, Porter had a clear voice on the national stage for nearly a decade. But his quest for mechanical improvements grabbed his attention again, and Porter left publishing in 1848 to advance his new ideas, especially for aerial navigation, which Justin is going to describe.
Sorry, thank you, Laura, very much. You can go on to the next slide. Yeah, I just want to, before I begin again here, I just want to hit on a point that Laura made that I think is really, really critical, is that in these scientific publications, Porter not only promoted, of course, new patents, new inventions, and mechanical improvements, but also the arts, right? And so this notion of the distinction between the arts and science and technology that really seems to characterize our present moment was not a dichotomy that Porter would have recognized, right? Just wanted to make sure to hit that point. Now, Porter likely got into publishing, as Laura mentioned, so that he could better compete in the cutthroat world of invention and patents. You know, in the 1830s and 40s, anyone, and believe me, anyone did, but anyone could send a patent request to the patent office, which at the time in DC was fairly disorganized. And getting a patent actually meant relatively little in the 1830s and 40s. The key was to promote the patent and either sell the rights for a profit or actually to scale it up and manufacture the invention for a profit. Now, all of this depended on getting the word out, and scientific journals were key. So Porter began to work as an inventor in earnest around 1834, when we see many of his proposals first popping up in publications like the Mechanics magazine. And as Laura has just explained, he then decided it would be advantageous to publish his own journals. Now, on the left here, the scale of signals of Porter's improved telegraph. What we see here is the intersection of his lifelong interest in social improvement and communications. Now, this is really, in fact, not a telegraphic system as we know it today in terms of an electric telegraph, but really this was an improved semaphore system for communicating information between Portland, Maine and Washington, DC. And it would operate, as he explains in the text accompanying this, by using a rigging system, much like you would see on a large boat, to move and manipulate these articulated masts and booms to create a kind of alphabet, right, to communicate various kinds of information across this distance. The most basic semaphore system that we know, of course, is the smoke signal. And this is clearly a 19th century and much more modern version of that. And as Porter describes in his really rich description of the possibilities of this improved telegraph, as he called it, news, weather, information about the comings and goings of ships, and really anything else worth sharing, could be communicated across great distances in really short order. He was at pains to describe the fact that even a child of 12 could manipulate the rigging that would operate these semaphore signals. And this is, I think, typical of the kind of optimism, right, of Porter. Now, it's critical to point out here, though, that Porter published this, right, and promoted his improved system because he was looking for investors. And beginning in the 1830s, this becomes a theme of Porter's life, is that he's proposing improvements or patents for the purpose of seeking investment. And he would form these stock companies for that purpose. In this particular case, he didn't find any investors for the improved telegraph, and that becomes a recurring theme throughout his life. But it's still a sort of fascinating example of design and invention. I love the fact that this improved telegraphic system is on the cover of a newspaper, right? Because in fact, the practical way of communicating information over great distance was through the newspaper, right? And through the distribution of that newspaper to more rural areas. And so, as I see it, it's a kind of a micro and a macro scale for Porter. The newspaper, the magazine, the journal is really the efficient way of communicating this kind of information. And yet he's using it to propose this much more, perhaps unrealistic sort of telegraphic system. On the right, we see something that's very typical of Porter, which is, it shows his love of hybrid systems. This is something we discovered in our research, is that this is so key to his inventions. Here it's the joining together, obviously, of shipping and railroads. And, and as an artist, as somebody who had a good sense of design, and in particular graphic design, right, he could lay this out on paper to look very sensible. But of course, it never really transpired. It just wasn't an efficient way of moving cargo from the ocean right into the inland. But this is something we see with Porter again and again, this sort of hybrid combination of already functional technologies. So in the next slide, please, Laura. It's important to point out here, just briefly, is that there's a long history of artist inventors, going back to Da Vinci and even earlier. But that's why Time magazine, right, called Porter the Yankee da Vinci, is this remarkable intersection of the arts, the visual arts, and invention. And it makes sense, I think, that artists would have been inventors. It's those skills, again, of spatial imagination, being able to visualize how things scale up and down. How do they fit? How does a model mapped out in 2 dimensions actually function in 3 dimensions? Okay, that kind of spatial sense is important. How to engineer design improvements. I mean, these are what link art and invention. And it's interesting to think again about that sort of false dichotomy that we've developed today about the difference between engineering and the sciences and visual art. Porter had no interest in that kind of distinction. There are famously other examples in American history, right? Robert Fulton, for instance, had been a student of the great American painter Benjamin West before deciding to make a fortune on the steamboat and pioneering the submarine or the Nautilus, and also advancing various kinds of naval warfare, in particular with torpedo design. And in this portrait of Robert Fulton by Benjamin West, you can see this kind of fiery genius. And in the background is an example of a torpedo explosion used in naval warfare. So Fulton is one of these perhaps more remembered characters who combined his skills of art and science. In the next slide, Laura, we can see that, I think, in more detail. You know, he was capable of Fulton of painting these really lovely miniature portraits, like we see here on the right of his wife, Harriet Livingston Fulton. And on the left, you see a watercolor drawing mapping out what is in fact the conning tower on one of his submersible vessels, or his Nautilus, as he called it. And it shows a kind of primitive periscope system, and it also shows the kinds of pneumatic mechanisms that were necessary for raising and lowering the vessel in the water. Fulton was marketing, by the way, this invention to Napoleon to be used during the Napoleonic Wars. Another great example is Morse. Laura, we can see these in the next slides. Samuel Morse, perhaps even more remembered for his intersection of art and science than Fulton. And perhaps most remembered as the inventor of the telegraph. But he was, prior to that, a portrait painter and a painter of miniature portraits in particular. We see on the far right a lovely profile portrait of a classmate from Yale, where he went to school. And on the left, this self-portrait that I think captures some of the spirit of West's portrait of Fulton, right? This kind of sense of intensity and genius. And then in the middle here, a sketch of a railway telegraph system that again combines this fascinating sense of scale. You see a horizontal landscape cutting through the middle of the watercolor drawing that shows the train, you know, the tracks cutting through the American frontier. And then on the top and to the left are in fact drawings and sketches of much more minuscule technological systems, in particular the ways that the track could trigger electronic signals right across distance to signal the movement of trains. So Porter is not alone in this intersection of art and science. And we can see in the next slide, please, Laura. Yet he is, in our mind, distinct in a couple of ways, which I'll talk about in a minute. Some of his wonderful inventions and improvements involve a tall clock that we see here on the left in the Rufus Porter Museum. It features his name on the face of the clock, indicating that he was in Billerica, Massachusetts. In a very brief memoir, a very brief essay that Porter wrote, which is really the only memoir that we have by him, he explains that when he wasn't painting the walls of interiors in the summer, he was spending all of his time obsessing over clocks and improvements to clocks. And in this particular case, it's an improvement to the mechanism of the clock. On the right, we see his patent model for a sensitive fire alarm. One of his few surviving patent models. This is just a wonderful object because it features, of course, in reverse painting on glass on the front, a sort of landscape that looks familiar to us from his wall murals, with that sort of that fence in extreme perspective, showing the practical use of this sensitive fire alarm. In the next slide, please, Laura. Here again, we can see using his publications to promote some of his, not always patents, but sometimes just suggestions for technological improvements. That love of travel and that sense of movement, rings true throughout his career. And I think what I wanted to point out most about these two is, again, that sense of a kind of the hybridization of technologies, right? I mean, obviously horsepower and water travel, but even in the steam carriage on the right, the principal mechanical improvement here is the use of a steam engine to power a carriage. But notice how the man sitting in the center console there, in the driver's seat, as it were, uses the old sort of reins of course that you would use to direct a horse, steering from left to right. You know, it's again this, Porter's unique ability is to map older technologies onto sort of newfangled ideas, and he's really tireless in this pursuit. If we can see the next slide, please. Yeah, I don't think I'll spend too much time on the Broadway elevated railroad that we see on the left, but again, with Porter, what we found is that some of his suggestions and designs are incredibly prescient, and it became quite practical. As Laura mentioned, just 22 years after he suggested the Broadway elevated railroad, there is an L in Manhattan that's put into use. Others of the things that he promoted, such as the self-moving wheel, this is not an invention or improvement of his own design, but it's something that he promoted in Scientific Mechanic, one of his later publications. Seems to us today to be a bit fanciful, and perhaps even in his own day it seemed that way. A kind of dynamo, a system that could generate its own movement in perpetuity, seems a bit far-fetched to us today. Next, please. Here, I just wanted to show quickly some of the kinds of designs and drawings that he would send in for his patents. For instance, and it also shows the range of his curiosity and interest. It was just unflagging and tireless. An improvement for a life preserver, an improvement and an invention for a corn sheller, which in fact, by some accounts, seems to have been quite effective. You could put an ear of corn in the middle and turn the wheel, and you would have a shucked ear of corn at the end. And next slide. One of the favorite objects that Laura and I discovered of Porter's was his plumb and level indicator. This is typical of the kind of improvement that he would make, and that something that he would call a useful art, right? This was an object that any mechanic would want in their tool chest. And in case one doesn't understand its purpose, right, there's this wonderful watercolor painting on the face that shows bricklayers, masons, trying to level a brick wall. And this is precisely the kind of task that this object would be used for. A great little detail, maybe not evident through Zoom, is that in the background we see Porter's beloved windmill. So it's interesting to see how Porter tied all these interests together in these various objects. Next slide, please, Laura. This culminates in what we remember Porter for most today, or what most people remember Porter for, which is his pioneering efforts to develop heavier than air flight, what he called aerial locomotion. Porter developed an interest in aerial travel as a young boy. There's a very poignant moment in his brief memoir in which he describes being a young boy watching the barn swallows fly in and out of the barn on his father's property. He also describes using some of the shingles from that barn to try to manufacture rudimentary wings so that he could fly above the earth. And he says that he was struck from a very young age by the sort of miracle of flight and the possibility of seeing the world from above. He first proposed formally his traveling balloon in 1834 in Mechanics magazine. Almost a decade later, we see that he's promoting the same sort of mechanism in Scientific American. The principle has changed very little. It features a spheroid or cigar-shaped balloon filled with gas that would be propelled through the air with the aid of a steam engine. And you can see in both of these a little puff of smoke coming out of the exhaust there on the far right. And this steam engine would turn a small propeller. Then underslung from that balloon was the carriage, or the saloon, as he called it, that would carry passengers. This was his principal discovery and engineering accomplishment in terms of aerial navigation. He proved that this was possible at a small scale anyway. He flew several models, small scale models of the traveling balloon in New York and Washington, D.C. to rapt crowds. These were events that were covered in the press and were celebrated. And it's, contemporary engineers and scientists have said that the principle itself was quite sound, right? Of course, he never realized heavier than air flight, but this is, to this day, perhaps his greatest legacy. We can see the next slide, please. He promoted aerial navigation in a pamphlet, a brief pamphlet that he published of the same title, Aerial Navigation. And you can see on the rear cover here, this from the Minnesota Historical Society, the principal promise that Porter made to the public, which was that this technology would fly prospectors for California gold from the East Coast to the West Coast in 3 days' time. And it is a wonderful document. Not only does he lay out in great detail within the pamphlet the engineering of his aerial locomotive, but he also includes these very rich descriptions in quite sort of purple prose, I might add, of the joys and pleasures that one would have flying over the plains in these aerial locomotives to see the great herds of buffalo, but also then dipping in and out of the peaks of the Rocky Mountains as one made entrance into the Sierra Valley. It's a wonderful combination of hyperbole and hope and optimism with quite sound engineering and technological improvement. And the next slide. Porter, one of the things that distinguishes Porter from Robert Fulton and Samuel Morse is that he opened himself up to parody and satire. And we see that best expressed in this wonderful Courier print lithograph, The Way They Go to California from 1849, which lampoons not only the hype of the gold rush itself, and we see all these pickaxed 49ers, right, jumping into the harbor to get on the ship. But in the upper left-hand corner of the lithograph, we see a replica of Porter's aerial steamer. And in the small text balloons, right, beneath, you can see the text saying, hold on to your hats. This is going to be a long ride, and cautioning the passengers from against getting airsick. And I think that what happened with Porter's aerial locomotive and his linking of it to the gold rush is that it became just easy to parody and lampoon. It became part of the speculative hype, right, and hyperbole that we see with the speculation of 1849. And it's hard to know whether this particular print or others like it caused Porter from further success with this enterprise, but it never came to fruition. And Porter is, it's true, partly to blame, and we can see this in the next slide. It's one of the things that he did was in creating a stock company to fund his aerial navigation company. He promised investors like William Marco, who was an Episcopalian minister, in living in Minnesota, who was also interested in aerial travel and was a principal investor in the aerial navigation company. We found these wonderful and quite poignant letters between Porter and Marco, in which Marco again and again asked Porter for reports on the progress of the aerial steamer. And Porter's responses were, it's plain to see today, were a lot of smoke and mirrors, right? He kept stalling and asking Marco for more money. He said, I'll get it off the ground. We can make this work if I just need some more funds. And Marco eventually grows frustrated and abandons Porter's aerial navigation company. And I think that this is one of the more poignant again and perhaps sad aspects of Porter's legacy is that he couldn't convince the public to invest in many of these inventions to scale them up. And we can see, I think, some of that legacy in the next slide, where as the centennial of the United States approached, artists like Christian Schussel and Courier Knives, the progress of the century, these iconic artworks that celebrate some of the more famous American artist inventors, such as Fulton and Morse. And Porter's left out of these commemorations. And Porter isn't pictured in either of these images. And it leads one to wonder, why? And what does that mean for Porter's legacy? And again, I think the reason why is that he couldn't scale up. He couldn't turn these ideas into products. And that's because he was distractible and would move on to new ideas quite quickly, but also because he didn't have, I think, the sort of fiscal acumen that was necessary to become a manufacturer and a producer of some of these objects. But that takes nothing away from his legacy. What we discovered in our research and work on Porter is that he had a really heady vision for a connected and interconnected United States. He designed improvements and thought every day about the common person. He was principally a Democrat before a capitalist, perhaps, and I think that's something that we can admire today. It's interesting to think about what he would have made of today's Silicon Valley. We think about some of the hype and hyperbole coming from a figure like Elon Musk, for example, promoting interstellar travel, but also the Hyperloop. And with this great sort of promise of improvement, but a great deal of skepticism about the practicality. And in that way, I think we should remember Porter, right? His legacy is that he is a person familiar to our era. He may not have gotten the patents and the fame and fortune of a Fulton or a Morse, but he was no less visionary. And it's a really moving story. And I think at the end of the day, Porter is someone we really should know better than we do. And hopefully this exhibition, our publication, and also, of course, what's happening at the Mercer Museum right now, will go a long way towards helping us remember Porter for his great contributions to American art and science. So that's what I have, and we're happy to answer any questions that the audience might have. And thank you for listening to us.
Thank you, Justin and Laura. That was phenomenal. I learned so much from it. I particularly loved the idea of the artwork in the houses for the gloomy northeast winters. As someone who has spent some gloomy winters in some gloomy areas, that particularly hit home. We do have a question from Matt. He says, I am curious about Porter's relationship to academic art. Is the tradition and history of Western art a subject he cared about?
Let's both take a stab at that, Laura. And I'll just say briefly that we think not, to put it sort of bluntly, which doesn't mean that he wasn't interested in art and that he wasn't aware of art history. Porter was, we think, definitely not intending to succeed, again, as what I call a fine artist. He was not competing with or attempting to get even commissions from those who admired academic art and fine art. He was, for lack of a better term, right, a commercial artist. He was looking to make a living. And he was an artist who was looking to, quite frankly, improve the lives through these miniature portraits and through murals of the people in the communities that lived around him. And I think that's a really great question, by the way. I want to say that to begin with. So Porter's place in art history, we might need a new category of artist, I think, to understand Porter. Laura, I mean, do you want to add some thoughts?
Well, I think the thing about Porter that's important to remember is that he was such a practical person. I mean, he had these great schemes for ideas that he couldn't realize, but he took what he knew and was able to create a living wage. And I think that when you look at his sort of the range of his miniatures painted over a 25-year period, they're wonderfully accurate, and they produced a really meaningful painting likeness for all these sitters. But it was the sort of the sense of having a practical means to create a beautiful portrait without having to be, academically trained and, living to some higher art ideal.
Yeah, and I think that's amplified, right? That's amplified, Laura, by the fact that he wanted to share these skills with others. He wanted anybody to be able to paint a landscape on walls or to paint a miniature, and his curious arts and some of his columns in Scientific American share his special knowledge of painting, because he wanted it to be something that anybody could practice. So it's an interesting distinction, and it's something that I should add does distinguish him from someone like Morris, right? Who certainly earlier in his career certainly strived to be a fine artist and an academic artist.
Porter did know about academic traditions in painting, because he has a really important series in his Scientific American, was the Art of Painting series, where he describes not only the landscape mural business, but also he talks about, Gilbert Stuart and great American portraitists. So he's aware of it. It's just not something that he's interested in doing himself. I think that's the way to
It's really interesting.
describe that.
If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A function, excuse me. And we will do our best. Laura and Justin, I know, will do their best to answer all the questions. It sounds like they are the experts here. I did have a question looking at some of Porter's drawings and early patent ideas and designs, and particularly some of the more fanciful ones. I was just curious of the impact they had on current day drawings of like a fantastical world in current media, in some of those like fantasy movies or sci-fi kind of world that maybe we imagine the past being like that, but it's actually more of Porter's imagination.
Well, I mean, I can take a stab at that. I think there is an aspect as practical as Porter was, and there is again a great deal of fantasy, frankly, to some of his endeavors, and it's just there's an admixture of the practical and the fantastical throughout his work, and I don't know that I can speak necessarily to how it manifests in the sort of contemporary images, but one of the connections that we have made was between Porter and someone like Buckminster Fuller, who also proposed, obviously about 100 years later, what seemed to us to be these kind of science fiction kinds of dwellings, and the Damaxian car, for instance, if you're familiar with that. These kinds of dynamic and perhaps utopic systems for living and for traveling that I do think have a resonance in what we today understand as perhaps fantasy and science fiction. It's a great part of Porter's legacy. As an observer, one sometimes wonders why he didn't see the obvious commercial or business opportunity in front of him and instead decided to propose something more far-fetched. But that's a charming quality to Porter that I just so happen to admire. But anyway, that's just one thought for your question.
Well, thank you. Well, I haven't seen any other questions come through. So I want to thank Justin, Laura, and Carla, and your entire museum. We are so honored to be able to partner with you and able to present this program to not only your constituents, but ours as well, and those who are interested in Rufus Porter. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Again, be sure to check out either the Rufus Porter Museum of Art and Ingenuity's website for upcoming events, as well as the Mercer Museum's website for upcoming virtual and in-person events as well. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Good night.
you, everybody.
Very much.